By the beginning of 1916, the First World War had raged for approximately a year and a half, and had seen movement warfare collapse into a bloody quagmire, with a network of trenches running all the way from Flanders to the Swiss Alps. Throughout 1915, British and French forces had tried and failed to break through the German lines. At Ypres, the Germans would almost make a breakthrough before reinforcements from the Canadians stopped them in their tracks, and at Neuve-Chapelle and Loos, the British would similarly try and fail to make a breakthrough. Winston Churchill, whose cousin Norman Leslie had been killed in October 1914, believed that there needed to be some alternative to chewing barbed wire in Flanders, and proposed that an invasion targeting the Ottoman Empire at Gallipoli would trickle down into giving the Allies an advantageous position in the west. But Gallipoli too would also fail, and lead to the embarrassing withdrawal of Allied forces by December 1915. Just a few days before the decision to withdraw was made, however, on December 6th, Allied leaders met at Chantilly in France to plan the defeat of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1916. At Chantilly, the Allies devised a bold plan to conduct large-scale offensives simultaneously by the British, French, Russians, and Italians on different fronts to prevent the Germans or Austrians from concentrating their limited resources on any single war zone. The Russians, led by General Alexei Brusilov, would conduct a two-pronged attack in the east, one prong striking at the Germans to the north and another prong against the Austrians to the south. Italy would again attempt to strike against the Austrians along the Isonzo River, aiming to penetrate deep into Austria. The British and French, on the other hand, would carry out a joint offensive in Picardy, on either side of the River Somme. The date set at Chantilly for this coordinated multi-front effort was in spring 1916. A.J. Balfour, former British Prime Minister, was convinced that the attack in the west would fail, as the Germans were, quote, straining every nerve to make their line impregnable. Balfour wondered if the Allies were able to fight in conditions where they could afford a far greater loss of life than their enemies, and create a perilous position for the Entente. He was rebuked by Kitchener, who saw that the Germans occupied major industrial and mining districts in northeastern France, and had the Germans maintained their position, they would be in a favourable position to negotiate peace, as the Allies would run the risk of losing by running out of resources. In response to planning at Chantilly, the British began moving vast amounts of troops to billets in France in preparation for the Somme offensive, an army made up of professional soldiers who had been fighting since 1914, territorials, colonial troops from Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and the new PALS battalions were assembled in preparation for the big push. Over the next few months, the Allies began training and preparing for the offensive, and even before the whistle would blow, death was a daily occurrence for men at the front, from snipers to artillery. On February the 21st, however, a German offensive at the fortress city of Verdun would throw a spoke in Allied plans. As the struggle grew more fierce, urgency for action at the Somme intensified. At a conference on March 28th, the French stressed to the British their need for relief due to mounting casualties, and Kitchener and General Sir William Robertson decided that it was time for the British to play their part. Casualty clearing stations, lodging and housing and railways were built in preparation. The French, owing to the bloody struggle at Verdun, told the British on May 19th that they had to reduce their commitment at the Somme from 40 divisions to 25, and even then they could not guarantee those divisions in a month's time for the big offensive. The British would attack at the north of the river and the French at the south, where the British would manage a much longer front line and face a larger number of German troops. On May 26th, General Joseph Joffre met with Haig to stress the need for the British to act. Haig went through several dates planned for the offensive, and Joffre became increasingly agitated as the dates became further and further away. Haig then said he was prepared for an offensive on July 1st. Preparations continued throughout June, and the opposing armies clashed daily. British moles were at work on the no man's land, laying 2 large and 9 small charges at Casino Point, 3 large ones at the Tambour opposite Fricourt, 2 large and 2 small near La Boisselle, and 1 large one at Beaumont-Hamel. Ammunition trains continued to arrive throughout June. A massive artillery bombardment opened up on June 24th along the British front. Through 5 days of intense bombardment, 1,500 guns fired 1,732,873 shells. Many shells, however, merely churned up already pockmarked ground, and some failed to explode. German fortifications, with dugouts 2 stories deep and reinforced with concrete, were untouched by the bombardment. Raids conducted as late as June 29th showed that German morale was high, a bad omen for the attackers. The French had to again reduce their commitment to a mere 8 divisions in the 6th Army. The British had 19. Both armies faced up to the Germans with 8 in service and 3 in reserve, and on the morning of July 1st, 1916, the Battle of the Somme would officially begin. At 7 a.m. on July 1st, 250,000 shells were fired at the German positions within an hour, an average of 3,500 shells per minute. The barrage was so intense that it was impossible to discern the detonation of individual shells. At 7:20, the British detonated a mine near Hawthorne Ridge, and at 7:28, 16 more mines were detonated by British sappers just 2 minutes before 0 hour. To allow British forces to capture the crater at Hawthorne Ridge, artillery briefly halted their bombardment. Although the explosion wiped out 3 sections of the German 119th Reserve Regiment, the downtime allowed the Germans in adjacent trenches to occupy their defences. The largest mine was detonated at La Boisselle, its crater measuring 450 feet across and 95 feet deep. Artillery was also halted in sectors facing the other mines and was instead concentrated on the German defences further back, giving the defenders 10 minutes to prepare. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blew, and British troops attacked across a 14-mile front, going over the top into no man's land. British soldiers were loaded with 66 pounds of equipment, including a rifle with a bayonet, 170 to 220 rounds of ammunition, 2 Mills bombs, a waterproof cape, 2 sandbags, a steel helmet, 2 gas masks, goggles for tear gas, first aid, and iodine, a waterproof ground sheet, water bottle, and haversack containing toiletries and rations. Some men also carried trench ladders, rifle grenades, wire cutters, and Bangalore torpedoes, further adding onto their heavy burden. It made it almost impossible for men to even get out of their trenches, and made it extremely difficult to move. The detonation of the mines was also ineffective, although it was intended that the mines would be detonated 2 minutes before the attack, which they were, and the British would take advantage of the stunned German defenders to attack. But since the mines were anywhere between 100 to 900 yards from the German lines, this gave them plenty of time to prepare for an attack. As the official historian of the German 119th Reserve Regiment put it, the mine under Hawthorne Ridge was a signal for an infantry attack, and everyone got ready and stood on the lower steps of their dugouts, rifles in hand, waiting for the bombardment to lift. The British assault began with diversionary attacks from Fontvillers to Maricourt. British soldiers from the 46th and 56th Divisions went over the top without any artillery support and suffered heavily. At Gomecourt, 2,765 British troops were killed and more than twice that wounded. The Germans suffered 400 killed and 800 wounded. The Fourth Army began its attack along a 14-mile front with the goal of seizing the villages from Serre to Montauban. The British bombardment there had failed to pulverize the German wire and fortifications, with the exception of the southern sector of the front near Montauban. On the northern tip of the attack, the 8th Corps of the 11th Battalion of the Accrington Pals went over the top. Its signallers watched as their comrades moved forward in an attempt to cross no man's land, only to be mown down like meadow grass. As the British infantry moved forward, about 100 German machine guns, untouched by the bombardment in their fortified positions, opened fire. Many British soldiers, forced to bunch up to get through their own wire, were cut down. At Chateau Valvion, Haig noted in his diary that reports up to 8 a.m. most satisfactory. Our troops have everywhere crossed the enemy's front trenches. This was not the case. South of the village Sur, the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment advanced to cut off Beaumont-Hamel by taking the Munich Trench. There, fighting was heavy and determined, and the official history describes how courageously the German defenders fought using hand grenades and hand-to-hand combat to drive the British back. British troops involved in the attack on the first day were predominantly from the industrial north and the Midlands of Britain. 29 battalions were raised from Yorkshire, 22 from Lancashire, 20 from Ireland, mostly Ulster, 70 from Tyneside, 14 from the Midlands, and 13 from London. Only one Dominion force, the 1st Battalion Newfoundland Regiment, was involved in the fighting. The Canadians had to cross 750 yards of exposed front without support from their flanks. Many were killed clambering out of their trenches, and very few reached the end of their own wire, 250 yards from the parapet. Very few Newfoundlanders made it within grenade distance of the German lines, and by 10 a.m. every officer was either killed or wounded. Out of 810 involved, 310 were killed and more than 350 wounded, with only 68 escaping injury. Along the left bank of the River Anker, the 1st Battalion Royal Dublin Fusiliers left their trenches at 9 a.m., but were trapped in their own wire. The 2nd Battalion attacked in the next wave, but they too were stopped by the intense German machine gun fire. Within 2 hours, most of the Irishmen were dead. The 16th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers, who were to attack Thiepval that morning, were told by their brigadier that you will be able to get over the top with a walking stick. You will not need rifles. When you get to Thiepval, you will find the Germans all dead. Not even a rat will have survived. The men advanced behind the dropkick of a football, but failed to reach the German wire. The inability to capture Thiepval greatly hindered British attacks elsewhere. For example, the British attack further south, near the Nab Valley, was overwhelmed by enfilading fire from Thiepval 800 yards away. There was greater success near Contalmaison, where the 16th Battalion Royal Scots had penetrated 1,000 yards, one of the deepest penetrations of the German lines that day. The most eastern part of the British attack was against the village of Montauban. Preceding the attack, 2 mines were detonated. The British were met by flamethrowers from the German lines and a machine gun, but the attackers persevered, overrunning the frontline positions. Despite German resistance, the attack on Montauban was the most successful attack that morning. Immediately after capturing the village, British logistical troops began their work of fortifying the town and bringing in supplies and reinforcements. Along the south of the Somme River, the French began their attack along an 8-mile front. Starting at 9:30 a.m., 2 hours after the British, the French went over the top. One unit of the French Foreign Legion had captured Baloy-en-Santerre by nightfall, at the cost of 25 officers and 844 men killed or wounded. General Fayolle, commander of the French Sixth Army, had used artillery and infantry tactics successfully to push the Germans back across the entire front. French artillery, including counter-battery fire, was ruthlessly effective. German artillery on the south bank was blasted with 1,500 French shells and fell silent by 11 a.m. The 37th Regiment, 11th Division of the 20th Corps, attacked Courleux and were initially repulsed. While waiting for rebombardment, the village was outflanked on either side, and bombardment forced the Germans to retire. The French were unable to exploit their successes here owing to the British failure to advance to their second objective beyond Montauban. The Germans tried and failed to retake the village with 4 counterattacks, and by mid-morning, the French had captured 2,500 prisoners and advanced 1 mile. The 1st Colonial Corps, made up of the 2nd, 3rd, and 16th Colonial and 99th Territorial Divisions, attacked the south bank. The 2nd and 3rd Divisions overran the first line of defences of the 121st German Division. In 15 minutes, they had taken Dompierre and Becancourt. The village of Frise had held out against the initial French attack, but fell when it was bombarded once again and taken at 12:30 p.m. Assevillers was taken at 4 p.m. and Herbecourt was captured at 5:30 p.m. but was lost again after a German counterattack. The attack on the south bank had advanced 1 mile. By the day's close, the opening of the Somme battle had been little more than a catastrophe for the Entente. Although the French forces to their south made significant gains, the British failure to capture most of their objectives forced the French to halt. The British Army had its darkest day, suffering almost 60,000 casualties, of which nearly 20,000 were killed in action. Of the 143 British battalions involved in the attack, 32 of them had casualty rates in excess of 50%. Stretcher bearers and Allied medical personnel worked tirelessly tending to the casualties. Abandoned trenches and shell holes were used as burial grounds. Many hundreds of men, unreachable due to German artillery and sniper fire, were left in agonizing pain in no man's land, some of whom would die of their wounds. Others managed to survive for almost a week through scavenging rations from their dead comrades. Although the French were successful, the British failure to advance in sync meant that they were unable to continue with their advance, lest they compromised the entire front. The Germans, too, suffered heavily, with between 10 and 12,000 casualties. Second Army Chief of Staff General Grenat agreed to a request for a tactical withdrawal by General Panowitz, but was rebuked by an outraged General Falkenhayn and was subsequently stripped of his command. The Germans attempted a counterattack at Montauban, but were repelled, although they still held a dominant position in the Somme front. British generals such as Haig and Rawlinson were unfazed by the slaughter of July 1st, with Rawlinson wanting to continue the battle on the 2nd, as there were plenty of fresh divisions behind. In the aftermath of the confusion of the first day, the overall plan was not adapted whatsoever, and pressure would be maintained in an effort to inflict further losses on the Germans and gain ground to launch additional attacks. The Battle of the Somme was not over, however, and would rage for another 5 months. By its end, the battle would total over 1 million casualties, making it the bloodiest battle on the Western Front. The Somme was a great test for Kitchener's mass volunteer army. The British would learn an expensive lesson in conducting mass industrial warfare, and sharpen the blunt edge of the British army into a sharp blade. The Germans would withdraw to the Hindenburg Line due to the casualties they suffered, with the Germans losing some of their most proficient and well-trained soldiers. The peacetime German officers, in Crown Prince Ruprecht's words, had been expended on the battlefield. The Allied armies would emerge from the attritional campaign at the Somme victorious, although at a very high cost. Despite the slaughter of the first day and the subsequent months, the First World War would still continue for another 2 years, and many hundreds of thousands more soldiers would be killed in the senseless slaughter on the Western Front. Thanks for watching.